Picture this, a cramped Moscow apartment in 1969. The wallpaper is peeling, the furniture is cheap, and the window looks out on a gray courtyard full of parked Ladas and Soviet concrete. On a small desk under a weak lamp, a young man hunches over a battered typewriter. Every keystroke echoes through thin walls. He pauses, looks at the title on the first page, and smiles at his own audacity. Will the Soviet Union survive until 1984? His name is Andrei Amalrik. He is not a general, not a spy, not a member of the Politburo. He is a historian expelled from Moscow State University for writing the wrong kind of thesis, a playwright whose absurdist scripts have been dragged into court, a man already exiled once to Siberia for the crime of not having a proper Soviet job. He has no security clearance, no access to secret economic data, no insider in the Kremlin. What he has is something much more subversive. He has eyes, he has a memory, and he has a typewriter. As he types, he is doing something that, to the Soviet state, is more dangerous than stealing a military blueprint. He is predicting the collapse of an empire that tells its people it will last forever. He does not only think the system will eventually fall, he names a deadline, the year 1984. On the other side of the world, American analysts are reading classified reports and satellite photos. They are counting missile silos, armored divisions, tons of steel. Most of them assume the Soviet Union will be around in one form or another for decades. Maybe it will liberalize, maybe it will stagnate, but disappear? That sounds naive. In this tiny apartment, to the clack of Soviet keys, someone is writing the opposite. He believes the system is built to break. He is early, but he is not wrong. To see how he got here, we have to go back 3 decades to a different Moscow and a different terror. Andrei Amalrik is born in 1938 in a city still echoing with the purges of Stalin. His father is a general in the Red Army, a man who has built his life inside the structures of Soviet power. You might think that would make the family safe. It doesn't. Even as a loyal officer, his father makes the mistake of criticizing Stalin. That is all it takes. The arrest comes, the uniform doesn't save him. The boy watches as the state that his father serves turns on him without hesitation. For a child, that is the first lesson about the rules of the game. Loyalty is a one-way street. As Andrei grows up, the slogans of the regime are everywhere: red banners, portraits of leaders, speeches on the radio. But around the kitchen table, the reality is different. He sees the gap between what is said and what is done, between the official story and the wounds in his own family. He is intelligent and curious, drawn to the past, the one thing the Soviet state claims to have solved and redefined. He enters Moscow State University to study history, stepping into a field that is less a field of inquiry and more a battlefield. In the USSR, history is not just a subject, it is a weapon. The party has its own version of the past, and deviating from it is not just an academic mistake, it is a political crime. For his thesis, he chooses to write about early Russian history, the Kievan period. He questions the way the official historiography links medieval Russia to the modern Soviet state. He challenges the story the party likes to tell about itself. His professors recognize that his work is serious, but they also recognize it as dangerous. In 1963, they reject his thesis. He is expelled from the university, not because he is a bad historian, but because he is too honest of one. His conflict with the regime begins not with street protests, but with footnotes. Out of the university, he drifts into a loose circle of writers and artists on the fringes of Moscow culture. He writes plays in an absurdist style, full of dark humor and surreal twists. They are the opposite of the optimistic, heroic dramas the state wants to see on stage. He spends time with the SMOG group, a cluster of young poets and writers who read banned literature, drank too much, and said the kind of things you are not supposed to say out loud. In 1965, he does something that looks innocent in a free country and suspicious in his. He tries to contact a Danish scholar through the Danish embassy in Moscow. In a system where any contact with foreigners is monitored by the KGB, this is enough to put him on a new list. The authorities move against him. They arrest him. They try to charge him with spreading pornography, pointing to his absurdist plays and his interest in non-traditional art. Expert witnesses, though, refuse to lie outright. They do not call his work obscene. The case starts to fall apart. The state, however, does not give up so easily. If one accusation fails, they have another in reserve. They reach for a classic Soviet catch-all, social parasitism. In a system that claims to have abolished unemployment, not having an official, full-time job is a crime. If you are an independent writer, living on odd jobs, family help, or the small sums you get for underground work, you are by definition a parasite on society. A tribunal finds him guilty of parasitism and sentences him to 2.5 years of banishment in western Siberia, near Tomsk. When the sentence is read, his life in Moscow ends. A new life in exile begins. He arrives in a Siberian village that looks like something out of the 19th century. Wooden houses, muddy roads, harsh winters, endless forest. He is placed under local supervision, assigned menial work, kept under informal surveillance. He is not in a concentration camp, but he is not free. Every letter he sends and every visitor he receives is watched. When his father dies, he is allowed a brief return to Moscow for the funeral. In that short visit, he meets an artist he already knows, a Tatar woman named Gusel Makudinova. He asks her to marry him and come back with him to Siberia. It is not exactly the proposal most people dream of. Come live with me in a place where the state has sent me to forget me. But she says yes. They go back together, forming a small island of shared defiance in a sea of fear and conformity. The exile in Siberia will later become the backbone of his memoir, Involuntary Journey to Siberia. The title is literal and ironic. He is discovering the real Soviet Union not through newspapers and schoolbooks, but through forced relocation. After about 18 months, surprisingly, the Supreme Court of the Russian Republic annuls his sentence. Officially, it is a correction of a mistake. Unofficially, it is a move in a game where the rules can be changed at any time. He is allowed to return to Moscow, but now he knows his status. He is a marked man. Back in the capital, he does not retreat. He dives deeper into dissident circles. He meets physicist Andrei Sakharov, who is just beginning to speak out, and human rights advocates like Yuri Orlov. They exchange samizdat, poems, essays, reports on political trials, all typed and retyped on Soviet machines with carbon paper. In these cramped apartments and smoky kitchens, a question keeps surfacing. How long can this last? To most people in the West, the Soviet Union looks strong. It has nukes, tanks, and an empire stretching from East Berlin to Vladivostok. It has just crushed the Prague Spring. It broadcasts its image of power and stability to the world. Inside, people like Amalrik see something else. They see a system that survives not because it works, but because it has a monopoly on force and information. Andrei decides to answer the question out loud, not in a whisper, not in a coded joke, in the form of a direct challenge. Will the Soviet Union survive until 1984? He sits down at that cheap desk, rolls a sheet of paper into his typewriter, and begins. In the essay, he argues that the Soviet system is structurally unsustainable. He writes that the bureaucracy has turned into a self-protecting caste. Its main goal is no longer building socialism, but protecting its own privileges. It is incapable of real reform, because any real reform would threaten the people who control it. He points to the economy. Without free information, the planners do not know what is really happening. Reports are falsified, targets are met on paper, never in reality. People learn to cheat the system to survive. Over time, this rot accumulates. He highlights the national question. The USSR is not just Russia. It is a multinational empire sitting on top of Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, Central Asian peoples, and many others. Officially, all nations are equal under socialism. In practice, Russians dominate. Local languages and cultures are suppressed. Resentments grow. He argues that the Soviet regime is isolated. The leaders are isolated from ordinary people, surrounded by yes-men who tell them what they want to hear. The country is isolated from the outside world behind censorship, travel restrictions, and propaganda. This isolation, he says, ensures that the leadership will misjudge both its own strength and the reactions of others. He speculates that the leadership might try to solve its internal problems by turning outward, for example, through a war with China sometime around the late 1970s. He suggests that such a war, combined with internal weaknesses, could trigger a crisis. He is vague about the exact path, but clear about the destination. He does not believe the Soviet Union can survive from many more decades. The date 1984, borrowed from Orwell, functions more as a symbol than as a precise prediction. It is the question that matters. Will this system still be here by then? In the Soviet Union of 1969, asking that question in public is unthinkable. But Andrei is not writing in public. He is writing for a small audience that he hopes will grow. He finishes the essay, makes 1 or 2 copies, and begins to share it carefully. Friends retype it. Carbon paper stacked between sheets creates multiple pages at once. Samizdat is flow, but it multiplies. Then comes the step that terrifies the KGB more than any samizdat circle. Someone carries the essay out of the country. We don't know every detail of the route, but we know the pattern. It goes from a Moscow apartment into the bag of someone with diplomatic immunity or into the hands of a Western journalist. It crosses a border at an airport that Soviet citizenship cannot cross so easily. In Amsterdam, the Alexander Herzen Foundation receives the text. The foundation is named after a 19th-century Russian exile who published banned materials abroad. The name is no coincidence. They read the essay, recognize its importance, and decide to publish it. They set it in type, run it through modern printing presses, and produce a slim volume in Russian. For the first time, the question that could send you to Siberia in Moscow can be read openly in bookshops in the Netherlands, France, Britain, and beyond. In London, the journal Survey publishes the essay in English. Translators take the dense, compressed Russian prose and turn it into clear English prose. Reviews and commentary follow. Within a year or two, Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984 is being read in capitals across the West. In Washington and London, some policy people shrug it off. The Soviet Union, they argue, has weathered crises before. It has a fearsome security apparatus. It has nuclear weapons. The idea that it might fall apart within 15 or 20 years sounds implausible. Others pay closer attention. They see in Amalrik's essay something they often suspect but rarely articulate, that the real threat to the Soviet regime is not an American bomber or a NATO tank, but its own internal contradictions. The essay sparks debates in think tanks and academic conferences. What if he's right? What if the structure is more fragile than it looks? In Moscow, the reaction is not a debate, it is a knock on the door. On May 21, 1970, near the village of Akulovo outside Moscow, the KGB arrests Andrei Amalrik again. This time, the charge is clear. He is accused of defaming the Soviet state in his writings. In November, he is put on trial and sentenced to 3 years of hard labor in a camp in Kolyma. For people familiar with Soviet geography, that name sends a chill down the spine. Kolyma is one of the harshest regions of the Gulag. It is far to the northeast, with winters that can kill unprotected skin in minutes. Under Stalin, it was a gold mining center built on slave labor. To send a man there, especially one in poor health, is to flirt with a death sentence. He boards a prison train, then prison ships, then trucks, traveling thousands of miles to the edge of the map. Along the way, the essay he wrote continues to travel in the opposite direction, from west to east, from one language to another. In the camp, he finds the same kind of dehumanizing routine countless prisoners have faced before him: hard work, cold, poor food, constant surveillance. On top of that, he is a political prisoner with an international name. Guards and officials know who he is. He becomes a target for pressure. He falls ill. He develops meningitis, a serious infection of the brain and spinal cord. He is taken to a hospital. For a while, his life hangs in the balance. Outside the USSR, his name is on lists circulated by human rights organizations. Western newspapers run stories about him, the man who predicted the Soviet Union might not survive, now himself trying to survive Kolyma. Amnesty International names him a prisoner of conscience. Western governments occasionally raise his case in diplomatic conversations. It is not that the KGB cares about Western opinion out of compassion, but the Soviet Union is engaged in a global competition for prestige. Killing a well-known dissident in a camp can be costly in that competition. In 1973, when his 3-year sentence in Kolyma is about to end, the authorities decide to give him 3 more years, this time not of labor, but of internal exile in the same region. The message is still the same: we can keep you here indefinitely. Under pressure from abroad, and given the state of his health, they eventually soften. He is allowed to leave Kolyma and in May 1975 to return to Moscow. He has paid a heavy price for a few dozen pages of text. The KGB does not sit him down and apologize. They continue to follow him. Agents show up for conversations. They make offers that are threats. Stop, or we will do this again. The pattern is familiar to many dissidents. In 1976, the state presents him with an ultimatum: either emigrate voluntarily or face new charges and likely new time in camps and exile. To stay would be heroic but probably suicidal. To leave is to admit that he will probably never see Moscow as a citizen again. He chooses life. He, Exile, and their daughter receive exit visas. They fly to the Netherlands, where he is offered a position at the University of Utrecht. He lectures on Soviet history, on dissidents, on the Gulag. For the first time, he is paid to explain the system that once punished him for trying to understand it. In exile, he becomes part of a larger network of dissidents and exiles, people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Vladimir Bukovsky, and others who have left the Soviet Union physically, but not mentally. They testify, they write, they lobby Western governments to keep human rights on the agenda. In November 1980, he travels to Spain to attend a conference connected to the Helsinki process, intended to monitor the human rights commitments signed by the Soviet Union and other signatories. On November 12th, driving with his wife and 2 others near Guadalajara, his car crosses into the oncoming lane and hits a truck head-on. He dies in or shortly after the crash. He is 42 years old. His companions survive with injuries. Spanish authorities report it as an accident. Some friends suspect darker forces, especially given the timing and his prominence, but no clear evidence emerges. The KGB has orchestrated accidents before, but it has also had many enemies die completely by chance. What matters in the end is that his voice is silenced just as the forces he diagnosed are starting to build. He never sees 1984. He never watches the sickly last years of the Brezhnev era, the brief interludes of Andropov and Chernenko, the rise of Gorbachev. He never sees the half measures of perestroika, the opening of glasnost, the way greater freedom of speech leads quickly to a tidal wave of criticism, national movements, and the unraveling of an empire. But if you read Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984 in the late 1980s, it feels less like a wild guess and more like a roadmap. He was wrong about some details. The Soviet Union did not fight a major war with China. It did not collapse precisely in 1984. But he was uncannily right about the big picture. He said the system would not reform itself into something healthy. It would crack. He said the national question would be central. When the end came, it came with national flags: Baltic, Georgian, Ukrainian. He said the isolation of the regime from its people would make it slow and clumsy in responding to crises. When the economy seized, the leadership lurched from one confused policy to another until it lost control. He said the collapse would be sudden. In 1991, it was. For Americans, his story is more than just an interesting biography. It is a case study in how ideas, when given the right environment, can be more powerful than guns. Inside the Soviet Union, his essay was a crime. Outside, it was a book. That difference had nothing to do with his talent changing at the border. It had everything to do with the systems on either side. On one side, a state that tried to lock up every typewriter, monitor every page of text, jam every foreign broadcast, and terrorize every would-be writer into silence. On the other, a world where technology and freedom converged, where a Dutch foundation could take a manuscript and, using modern printing presses, flood the world with copies, where a British journal could publish a translation without asking permission from any politician, where American and European universities could assign the essay to students, discuss it, critique it, and argue about how seriously to take it. The Soviet Union was not shaken by the CIA printing pamphlets in secret basements. It was shaken by a culture in which almost anyone with a good story or sharp argument could, theoretically, find a publisher. That culture depended on a long chain of things: private presses, relatively cheap paper, copy machines, international shipping, postal systems, and, above all, a legal environment where the state did not decide what could be printed. If you want to understand why Soviet leaders were so often alarmed by what they called ideological subversion, look at this chain. It meant they could not win the information war by controlling one TV channel and one newspaper. The other side had thousands. Andrei Amalrik sat at a desk in a city where such an ecosystem did not exist, but he knew it was out there. He knew because Western books and magazines, however controlled, still made their way in, because foreign radio broadcasts carried different voices, because rumors of what was being said abroad filtered back. He bet that his words, once they reached that world, would not die. He was right. Whether you agree with all his judgments or not, his life proves a point that is easy to forget in an era of instant communication. The battle over the future of a superpower was not only fought with missiles and tanks, it was also fought with type bars and printing plates. In that battle, the side with more open technology and freer institutions had an advantage that no secret police force could erase. A battered Soviet typewriter in a Moscow apartment produced a question. Western presses, radios, and classrooms turned that question into a challenge that the Soviet Union, in the end, could not answer.